Welcome back to my Wetland Plant Identification class. I'm your host, Abe Lloyd, and this unit we're going to focus on marsh plants, not just any old marsh plants, but specifically salt marsh vegetation. And salt marshes are pretty diverse. We could have estuarine salt marshes or coastal salt marshes that are a little bit more separated from river systems, so they're saltier. And today we're going to explore the estuarine salt marsh at Craft Island, where I am now, down in Skagit County. And maybe if there's time and I have energy, I'll also show you a little bit of a more of a coastal salt marsh that isn't associated with the river system, and the vegetation there is a little bit different. So, give you a little bit of an overview of these coastal and estuarine salt marshes. They tend to have vegetation that is limited by three different things. They need to be adapted to water, like all marsh vegetation and wetland vegetation for that matter. They need to be adapted to salt, especially if they're growing in more coastal systems, less associated with a river system. And they need to be adapted to different sized sediments. So some systems have a lot of coarse sediment, coarse sand, or even gravel. Some systems have a lot of silt. And the estuarine systems, those that are associated with rivers, tend to have a ton of that silt. So hopefully you're staying dry. I'm getting pretty wet. Have a cup of hot chocolate for me. Behind me is the Skagit River. This is at the delta. The Skagit River actually breaks into two different portions, and this is the North Fork of the Skagit River as it goes around the north side of Fir Island and dumps into Skagit Bay. Now, we're in kind of a unique spot because usually the tide flats and the lower river mouths are dead flat. They're about the flattest places on landscapes that you could find where you're on dry ground. In this case, it's ground that isn't always dry. But we're lucky, and so it's hard to get a vantage of anything in these really flat areas. But we're kind of lucky because the mouth of the Skagit actually goes around some little islands that aren't really islands anymore except at high tide. And so here on Craft Island, I'm maybe, 100 feet or 50 feet above the marsh plain, and we can have a nice vantage of everything around us. So as I mentioned in the lecture, the marsh is divided into we have mud flats down in areas that are covered with water most of the time. The tide is rising now, and so those mud flats are going to start disappearing soon. It was just low tide about 2 hours ago. And then above that we have what's called the low marsh, and low marsh vegetation tends to be a lot like some of the emergent vegetation that we saw at Tennant Lake. So we have a lot of plants with adaptations for dealing with saturated standing water conditions. So they have that erythematous tissue that transmits the oxygen down into the root zone. A lot of graminoid type things in the low marsh. And then we have the high marsh. We tend to see a lot more herbaceous stuff in the high marsh, especially over here. That basically is mostly high marsh community there. And then on the ends, at the top of that, we can kind of see this shrub transition zone. So we'll get that shrub transition zone more readily when there's a ton of fresh water like there is at this Skagit River system. But in some of the salt marshes that aren't associated with the river, the coastal marshes, it's a lot more abrupt because that salt water just kills all the woody plants. Okay, so we're gonna work our way from the bottom down up to the top just so that we can stay ahead of the tide today, explore the vegetation here in this salt marsh. And we're going to have a little bit of an emphasis on rushes, especially the genus Juncus, and then we'll also hit a few sedges and a lot of herbaceous stuff in the high marsh. And actually we're going to try and find our way into a couple channels where there are some cool plants that are really adapted to more water. The salt marshes don't tend to have a lot of floating leaf plants or submerged leaf plants like the fresh marsh does, but you see these channels that form These are what are called blind channels, and they go up. They're not draining a river. They just drain the water that gets on the marsh plain at every high tide, and that water needs to drain out. And so over, time, it drains better in a channel that erodes deeper and deeper and deeper, and you get these blind channels that look a little bit like upside down rivers, and that they're widest down near the mouth, and well, I guess other rivers are like that too. Anyway, so these blind channels are a better place to find some of that submerged leaf plants, and maybe, if you're lucky, a few floating leaf plants. So that's the overview. Let's get to it. One of the first plants we're going to encounter when we walk up the mudflat and we get into the low marsh is this here, and this is called Skenoplectus pungens, or common three-square. Three-square, that's a pretty easy name to remember as a common name goes, and it's called three-square because like a lot of sedges, which is this is in the Cyperaceae, or the sedge family, it has a stem that has 3 sides to it. Now there are actually 2 species that have this kind of same form, where they're just a shoot sticking out of the ground with just a few little basal leaves and this lateral spike on the side. So there are 2 that look remarkably similar, but the second one, the Skenoplectus americanus, when you cross-section that, it has more of almost a star-like cross-section. Of course, there are just 3 points, but the points really flare out to a acuminate tip, and the sides are really indented, whereas this one, the sides are virtually flat, the sides of the triangle. This Skenoplectus pungens typically has 1 basal leaf. Here we go, 1 basal leaf. Right now they're starting to wither a little bit. But from a distance it looks a little bit like it has just a bare stem. The inflorescence is lateral on the stem, usually a few inches below the top, and it has a spike that's sessile, so it lacks a stalk, and usually there aren't too many spikes or clumps of flowers. So this one has just 1. This one here has 1, 2, 3 spikes, and this one here has 4, I think. So those are all good features for the Skenoplectus pungens, or common three-square. Skenoplectus pungens has a pretty broad habitat tolerance within the marsh. So sometimes you'll see it down at the bottom of the low marsh, and sometimes you'll actually see it up pretty high at the upper end of the low marsh. I think it handles disturbance pretty well, so this area gets battered by waves, as the low marsh community does, because as you move into the marsh, the vegetation really buffers the waves. So the further you are from this transition line here, the more protection you get from bigger waves. But this doesn't have a lot of leaves, and so there's not a lot to catch and resist waves, and it won't get yanked out of the ground as easily. This is typical low marsh here, and we could see that there's a lot of that common three-square growing along here. But there's another plant that I want to point out. Here we go. This is a rush. Here, in amongst all this common three-square, a type of bulrush, we have a true rush. Now, I taught you the mnemonic: sedges have edges, rushes are round, and grasses have joints or nodes all the way to the ground. We need to also focus in on the floral features. Now, all of these graminoids, or grass-like plants, have simplified flowers. They don't have big showy petals. Some of them have even lost their what would be petal features. But one good feature for the rushes, the Juncaceae, is that they still have somewhat petal-like features. We call them tepals because we can't tell if it's a sepal or a petal, and a tepal is this general term that can capture that represents both sepals and petals. So the Juncaceae, they have 6 tepals. And when we zoom in here close on the flower, we can see those 6 tepals. Contrast that to the bulrushes, which are part of the Cyperaceae. They have lost all their petals altogether, and each flower, the stamen or the pistil of the flower, has just one little teeny scale that's at the base of it. And then the grasses, we're going to talk about those another day, but they have, instead of just one little scale, they have 2 scales that are either side of the flower, kind of like that, called a lema and a palea. Okay, so let's take a close look at, this one isn't super, oh, here's one, that's good. Close look at the flower, and we could see 6 tepals around the outside, and we could see 6 stamens that are kind of a creamy white color, and then we can see a pistil right in the middle of the flower with a stigmatic surface that looks sort of feathery sticking out. So all the rushes are going to have those 6 tepals. I mentioned there are 2 species of juncus that kind of have this look, and the look I'm referring to is a terminal inflorescence. So all the flowers are up at the top of the plant as opposed to off the side of the plant. And the clumps of flowers tend to just be a few in a clump, like this one has 3 to maybe 5 in a clump. Anyway, there are a couple 2 species that do that, but this Juncus articulatus is distinct in that it often sort of sprawls along the ground before it ascends more upright. And it can root nodally. Doesn't always do that, but here we can see that there is a little root hair sticking out here, and so that can grow into the ground and become a new plant if it gets severed over here. So that nodal rooting is a good feature for the Juncus articulatus. It has a stem that is not perfectly round, it's sort of ovoid when you roll it, and the leaves kind of clasp around the stem. The leaves themselves are also kind of ovoid, a little bit more compressed than the stem. Here we have Triglocken meridema. This plant looks a little bit like a grass. It has these pretty linear, roundish leaves, although they're a little bit cupped on one side where they press against when they're young each other. A good feature for this one is the smell. It really smells like cilantro, especially down near the leaf base when you break it. And when they're young, earlier in the spring, the leaf bases are really white, and you can actually eat that white tissue at the base, and it tastes like cilantro too. They're getting too old now. Triglocken is not a grass. It has more showy flowers, at least more showy than graminoids. They're still pretty inconspicuous, and they elongate as the plant ages. You can see this is a young spike of flowers, the type of inflorescence called a spike, where each flower is attached to the central stem. Here they're getting more spread out as it ages. And they are faintly purple. They can also actually be a little bit white. These here are purple. So that's the Triglocken. Look for it in the low marsh. This plant is pretty dang tolerant of salty conditions. So there is some of it here in this estuarine salt marsh, but it's one of the few plants that can handle almost full strength seawater, and you could see it in lagoons and coastal marshes as well. Here we have Liliopsis occidentalis, or western Liliopsis. Now this is a pretty small plant, and it might just look like young Juncus articulatus, but if you take a look at each of these blades, they have a ton of those constrictions, or they have a ton of these constrictions on them. Every inch or so or less, it's constricted. And the flower, this is in the Apiaceae, the carrot family. So it should have flowers and umbels. And in this case, these umbels are minuscule. So we could see how each of the flowers goes back to, has a stalk that connects with a bunch of other flower stalks at one point. So they're white flowers, very small. And they like growing on fresh channels in a estuarine salt marsh. These plants are not very salt tolerant at all. In my experience, I only see them in areas with a lot of fresh water dumping in. We're getting a little higher now and into a area where we have a lot of this sedge, and this is called Carex lingbii, or Lingby's sedge. And it's pretty closely related to the sedge that we saw in the swamps, the Carex obnupta. I think it looks more similar to that than any other sedge. So here are two inflorescences. We can see that they are, the spikelets dangle on what's called a pedicel. And we have two male spikelets up here, and looks like there were two female spikelets down here. Now sometimes they're mixed. So here, this one has one male spike up on top, and then it has a spike that the upper portion of it is female flowers and the lower portion is male flowers. And then this one has both as well, but then the lowest spikelet here is all female flowers. And the seed of a carex is called an achene. I'll get more into that next week, but these have kind of straw-colored achenes. Remember that the slough sedge, the Carex obnupta, had really dark-colored achenes. So that's a good feature for telling it apart from slough sedge, is the general lighter appearance. This is the only sedge that grows in brackish water, so it can tolerate a little bit of salt inundation. So if you're in a salt marsh and you see a sedge, it's probably Carex lingbii. You know, it's got that triangular or edgy stem. It's not sharp at all. The leaves, on the other hand, are a little bit sharp, but not as sharp as the Carex obnupta, the slough sedge. Here around me, I'm in the high marsh community. And this is a community that is one of my favorites. It's got some more diversity of like herbaceous plants, not so dominated by graminoids, although we're going to see some graminoids in here as well. And the community here doesn't have to be as tolerant of salt inundation, especially in the estuarine type of salt marsh. And it doesn't actually have to be as adapted to water either, because this community can go days, weeks, or even sometimes months without getting flooded by a high tide. But they do have to tolerate the occasional inundation with water, and especially brackish or salt water. So this community transitions into an upland. As I walk this way, we can see that starting to get some taller and taller herbaceous plants, and then over here we actually get into some shrubby plants like salmonberry and willows and things that don't really handle salt inundation for one, and then some of those things aren't even really wetland plants, like some of the shrubs up on the hill there. Here we have silverweed all around me really, but this one here is flowering. So it's got this yellow flower. It looks a little bit like a buttercup flower, but it's actually in the rose family, the Rosaceae. And it's got 5 petals, has multiple stamens, and also multiple pistils. Not a lot of flowers have multiple pistils, but that's more common in the rose family. It's called silverweed as a common name because the undersides of the leaves are very silvery. When the wind is blowing, sometimes they'll flash this silvery color, which I think is really pretty. It frequently frequently will grow in these apparent monocultures of silverweed. And let's see, oh, the scientific name is Potentilla anserina or Argentina egadi. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of consensus about what scientists should be calling this name, this plant. It's also sometimes called Potentilla pacifica or Argentina anserina. All right, some more features. It has kind of a reddish tinge at the base of the leaves, has a pinnately compound leaf, and a lot of times pinnately compound leaves have strictly opposite leaflets, but these, as you get down towards the base, are sometimes more alternate. And it expands by these stolons in a very similar way that strawberries will kind of expand. One of my favorite plants, actually a plant that I did my master's research on, because it has an edible root. At this time of the year, this plant has to be the most striking thing in the marsh. This is called Rumex occidentalis, or western dock, and it's just exploding with this red color. The seed heads right now are red, and of course the leaves here are also a little bit reddish tinged. This is a member of the Polygonaceae, or the dock family, and remember I pointed out when we were in the canoe how the nodes of the Polygonaceae often have these papery sheaths. So that's true of this one as well. Good feature, well, in this environment it is unmistakable by just the volume and size of these seed heads. But come in close and we'll show you a feature of each of these little seed things that's characteristic for the western dock. This plant has seeds and flowers, for that matter, but right now seeds that are surrounded by these leafy bract things. And on many of the other docks, they have little hairs that stick out from the tip, or they're two-sided. But on this species, the Rumex occidentalis, you could see that they are three-sided. So there's 1, 2, 3 of these bracts that all come together. And if we peel them open, we can see on the inside the seed. Wait for it, there it is. So that's the seed of the dock. Here's the flower that it, or the structure that it came out of. There's another one. So they're pretty sizable on this species. Everything about this is big for a dock species. Here is Symphyotrichum subspicatum, or Douglas aster. This aster has flowers that have ray florets that are purple. It's not flowering yet. It usually doesn't bloom for maybe 2 or 3 more weeks. And this is found up at the highest end of the high marsh, typically. It doesn't really handle salt inundation very well at all. So look for it more in the estuarine salt marshes rather than coastal marshes. So let's see, it gets pretty tall. It has opposite leaves. It's pretty hairless or glabrous. The leaves are sessile, okay, so it lacks a petiole on the leaves. And then it has those a composite flower made up of both ray and disc florets, but the outside ray florets are purple. This beautiful plant is unfortunately a pretty problematic invasive species called Lythrum salicaria, or purple loosestrife. So it has these spikes of beautiful purple flowers with pretty big petals. We could see that it has opposite leaves, and it has a habit of not only flowering terminally, but also flowering in these lateral or axial branches. And it will grow in uplands, you know, is introduced into the area as a garden plant because it's so showy, but it does like growing in marshes, especially the slightly drier portions of marshes like the high marsh here. So not the greatest thing for this marsh. Hopefully it won't take over and maybe somebody will come pull it out, I'm not sure. Purple loosestrife. Here is Juncus balticus, or Baltic rush. Grows in actually quite a few different wetland habitats, fens and marshes, but I almost always see it in these estuarine and coastal marshes. Now we're going to key this one out as our introduction to the Juncus key. So I'm just going to pick this here flowering stem to start us through the key. So the key starts by asking, are the plants, 1A, plants annual, or 1B, plants perennial? So if the rush is really well rooted in the ground, that's a good indication that it is a perennial, and that's the case for this. Without a shovel, I don't think I could get this out of the ground because the roots are really well developed. So we can go with 1B, plants perennial. Okay, so we can go down to compare 2A to 2B. 2A reads inflorescences apparently lateral, and 2B says inflorescences terminal. This is coming out of the side of the shoot here, so that's a good indication. Well, that basically tells me that it's lateral, not terminal. If it was coming out of the tip, that would be a terminal inflorescence. So I could go to 2A. And that takes me to group 2. This key is so big that they divide it into 6 different groups for the Juncuses, the Juncaceae. Okay, group 2. So now I'm on the page for group 2. It jumps to 15. I'll compare 15A to 15B. Plants long rhizomatous, mid-rhizome internodes often 1 centimeter or more, or plants, 15B, plants cespitose, mid-rhizome internodes usually much less than 3 millimeters. Okay, I discussed this once before in a different video, but generally plants that are rhizomatous can form these huge expanses, and they just cover everything. Whereas plants that are cespitose have like a clump here and a clump there. So the fact that all of this around me here is all, well, don't look too far. This clump isn't or this patch isn't as big as they sometimes get, but this is a rhizomatous plant. I could tell easily because I don't see a little teeny clump here, a little teeny clump there. It's basically covering everywhere. So we go with 15A. So below 15A we have 16A versus 16B. 16A, some stems with well-developed stem-like leaf blades. Floodplains, canyons, canyon bottoms. Okay, or 16B, no stems with well-developed stem-like leaf blades. Okay, so does this thing even have leaves? Some stems with well-developed stem-like leaf blades. All of the stems on this plant go down to the bottom. So there are no branching stems. The stem doesn't branch and have like lateral leaves coming off of it. So I'm going to have to say that means that no stems with well-developed stem-like leaf blades. Yeah, so we're going to go 16B. Okay, below that we compare 17A to 17B. 17A says tepals green or pale brown. Inflorescence bract generally greater than the stems. Shore marshes, wet meadows. Or 17B, tepals dark brown or black. Inflorescence bract generally smaller than the stems. So here we see that the tepals are a rather dark brown color, and the key actually says, what was it? Oh yes, tepals either green or pale brown on 17A, or 17B was tepals dark brown or black. So we can choose 17B. And it follows up by saying the inflorescence bract is generally smaller than the stems. So this actually, even though it appears that the inflorescence is coming out laterally, this here is actually a bract that's just sticking straight up, and it looks like it's a continuation of the stem. So the inflorescence bract is less than the stem. That just means that the stem extends down, like 30 or 40 centimeters, and this bract is only about 5 centimeters. Or, no, it's longer than that. It's probably like 10 centimeters. So that puts us 17B. Now below that we have 18A and 18B. 18A reads, fruit tepals generally 4 to 5.5 millimeters. Inflorescence open, branching, damp meadows, vernal pools, and salt marshes, ditches, shores, common throughout our area below timberline. 17B, fruit tepals generally 6 to 8 millimeters long, so almost twice as long, about 50% longer. Inflorescence capitate, coastal damp sandy ground, dunes, and salt marshes, margins, Haida Gwaii to California. Okay, so it sounds like both of them grow in salt marshes, so the real key here is to measure the tepals on when the plant is fruiting. And most of them are actually fruiting now. I got lucky and found one that was flowering. So let's take a measurement of the tepals. Fortunately, I always carry a little caliper with me into the field, and so I could measure the length of one of these tepals. There we go. It looks like it's about 5.5 millimeters. 4.5 millimeters. And 18A read fruiting tepals generally 4 to 5.5 millimeters. So I'm in that range. It definitely is not 6 to 8 millimeters. So we have Juncus balticus, which I knew it was anyway, but that's the introduction to the key to the juncuses, Juncaceae. This here is Juncus effusus, or common rush. Now this rush shares some features to the Baltic rush, which is basically growing everywhere around it. But it is a lot bigger, and I think the key difference, well, first I'll mention some similarities. We can see that they both have apparently lateral inflorescences. But the key difference is the size. This is much more robust in every manner. And also the Baltic rush, Juncus balticus, is rhizomatous, and so it can just cover large expanses, whereas Juncus effusus is cespitose. So we could see here that this is all one plant. There's another clump that's starting to grow right here, and maybe it'll grow a little bit bigger. Oh, here's another one over here. So this is the nature of cespitose plants. They just spring up here and there. Here we have Scenoplectus tabernaemontani. Now this is commonly called soft stem bulrush. And like the hard stem bulrush, it doesn't have any leaves. From the bottom all the way to the top, it doesn't have any leaves. Now the flowers tend to be concentrated right at the top. These hardly have any stem on the spikelets. A few of them do, but it still has that little bract that sticks out to the side on this one. Sometimes they point a little more upright. Scenoplectus tabernae montani can get to be a lot fatter. This is at least an inch in diameter here. It has fewer cells across the diameter, usually less than 10 or so, especially when you're cutting it about halfway up the plant. That means that when you squish the stem, there are fewer cells to resist that squishing motion, and it crushes really easily. This is another high marsh plant, and I've been looking for it as we tromp through here. This is in the pea family, again, the Fabaceae. We can see that bilateral symmetry, and another common pea feature is that the tip of the leaves have these tendrils, and the tendrils wrap around vegetation like this, or here, and that helps the plant stay upright without any woody stem. So your garden peas and pole beans, they do this. Now this is Lathyrus palustris, pea of the marsh. And a good feature is that the stem is winged, so it has this kind of leaf-like wing on either side of the stem. In one direction it looks a little bit iris-like, and that it's flat, and in the other direction you can see that it sticks out. It has leaflets that are pinnately compound. Usually they have 6 leaflets, 2, 4, 6. Yeah. 2, 4, 6, yeah, leaflets. And either this kind of darker purple color, or sometimes a little bit more pinkish purple flowers. And it produces a pea with several different, a pod of peas with several different peas or seeds inside of it. If you find a Lathyrus species, there are really only 2 options for what it could be if it's growing coastally. It can either be Lathyrus palustris, like this here, or Lathyrus japonicus. And Lathyrus japonicus usually grows on surf-swept beaches in gravel or sand, whereas this usually grows in salt marshes. So the habitat should be enough to identify this, but this leafy kind of stem is a good way to tell. This is Disticus spicata, or saltgrass. This is very much so a coastal salt marsh species. Occasionally you'll find it in the estuarine salt marshes too. And let's see, some features that I like. Well, it never gets super tall, usually less than about a foot or so, maybe a 1.5 feet in a good site. And the leaves always kind of branch at this really, I don't know, they just have an angular look where they branch at maybe 60 degrees from the stem all the way up. And you can see that from a distance. Here is the inflorescence. So kind of inconspicuous, more greenish colored. And they form these mats that can be really expansive, kind of soft. This is Atriplex patula, or auric is the common name. And it has these opposite leaves that look a little bit like, I think, a shovel head. You'd stand on this part of the shovel and drive it into the ground. If you look really carefully at the leaves, they're kind of covered with fine gray dots. And that's another good feature. This plant is very tolerant of salt water, and you could see it at the just at the high water line on beaches, with ocean beaches. And the leaves are edible. So that's Atriplex patula or auric. Here is yarrow or Achillea millifolia. This plant is in the aster family, the Asteraceae. So it has composite flowers. You can see it has these white strap-shaped flowers, and the disc flowers are yellow on the inside. Actually, some of them are white. So I guess they vary in color, probably depending on whether the stamens are out or not. The leaves are finely dissected. They're filamentous, you might say. It's sort of like the aquatic plants, but this is more of a marsh transition plant, so it's at the very high end of the marsh. Really aromatic plant, smells delicious, and you can make a tea from it. So that's Achillea millifolia, used to treat Achilles wounds. That's why it's named Achillea. Here we have Bulbocernus maritimus. Now this is a type of bulrush, and it has a triangular stem and leaves and bracts. So I think a really good feature to clue in on right away is that there are a whole bunch of spikes all clumped together. Most of them don't have stalks on them, but every now and then you'll see one maybe that does have a stalk. And the spike is subtended, or beneath the spike, the cluster of spikes, you have bracts. And usually one of the bracts is quite large and one is smaller. Sometimes this one here, we see it has one large one, one small one, and one even smaller one. So 3 is not unusual. The stem is quite triangular. It's not sharp though, it's not going to cut you. And then down lower on the stem, we could see that it actually has quite a few leaves. And the lower you get on the stem, the more round-cornered the stem gets. And in fact, when this plant is just coming out of the ground in the spring, it's almost spherical at the base. And that confuses some people when they see it in the spring, because they think of this species as being a triangular culmed species. But don't let that fool you. So it's growing here in kind of, it's low marsh. Sometimes it's found in the high marsh occasionally. It tolerates a decent amount of salinity. And that's the Bulbocernus maritimus. Okay, here's a pretty little species. This is called Cachula coronapopholia, or brass buttons, because they're yellow. I guess brass is kind of yellow colored, and they look like little buttons. Now, this species really likes colonizing recently disturbed areas and relatively open, kind of mudflat type areas. And that's sort of what's going on here. We actually left the Craft Island marsh, and this is a recently restored marsh area. They breached a dike. It used to be farmland, and the dike kept the salt water from inundating the farmland and killing the farm plants. But when they breached the dike, then the salt water could come back in here, and it, killed all the plants and left this bare soil. They only did it maybe 3 or 4 years ago, so plants are still colonizing the area. You could see there's patches of bulrushes out there poking up through the marsh like they should at high tide. This is, in a little bit higher spot than those bulrushes, but it tends to tolerate pretty brackish water. So besides these yellow flowers, it has a pretty thick stem, and it kind of often sprawls flat on the ground, like here and there. And the leaves are somewhat linear, and they're sessile, and they have some lobes on them, or little points occasionally. Here I have Juncus bufonius. Another Juncus species, and this one is an annual, so when I rip it out of the ground it should have pretty wimpy roots. Yeah, look at, barely has any roots at all. Some other features of the Juncus bufonius is that it's really kind of everywhere. It's got flowers that are down pretty low on the plant and also up pretty high on the plant, and leaves at these branches. So it never really gets too tall, maybe always less than a foot, I would say. And like most annual plants, it needs a lot of disturbance to grow. So this is a perfect environment where it hasn't, this mudflat hasn't really been colonized by a lot of these more robust perennial species yet. And so an annual that is never capable of getting very tall in a single growing season can thrive in this particular environment. I also see Juncus bufonius in like dirt roads, next to mud puddles, things like that. So not the most glamorous of Juncus species, but our focus is on Juncuses today, so we'll add it to the list. Let's take a closer look at these flowers. So the tepals of the Juncus bufonius are not really brown or black like some of the other Juncuses. They're actually fairly green, and my memory is that as they mature they actually turn a little bit more like a red color rather than a brown color. So that's another good feature. We see that there's just one flower there, another flower down there. Many Juncuses have clusters, aggregations of maybe 3 or 10 or 50 flowers all together at one one point, but this one, the flowers mostly are single. This is a fun plant. It's called saltgrass or pickleweed because the stems have a real salty flavor. They're actually really thick, and they have the capability of concentrating salt in parts of their stem, and that keeps the salt from killing other parts of their tissue. So salt water can be toxic to plants, but this plant deals with it by concentrating in it. I think it can actually secrete salt from some structures. And the scientific name is Sarcocornea virginiana. And I enjoy nibbling on it. So this plant does really well in salty areas. One of the more common plants in the coastal salt marshes. The flowers are borne on these terminal spikes. They almost look just like the stem at this time of the year, but later they'll become a reddish color. And the anthers are sticking out of the flower right now, or actually those are the stigmas, I think. Anyway, they look like little cones almost. All right, we got spike rush here, Eleocharis palustris. Again, remember palustris means of the marsh. In the salt marshes, we get palustris and meridemus or meridema or something related to either of those quite often in the species epithets. So it has a round culm, but the flowers are always in this terminal inflorescence. So right now the anthers, the stamens with kind of long yellowish or kind of a cream colored anther are poking out of the spike near the tip. This plant can sometimes get to be about 2 feet tall and maybe 3 times as thick as it is here. But it's here, so I'm happy to see it. So if you see a terminal spike like this, good thing to consider is the possibility of it being Eleocharis. All right, another find down in here amongst the Triglocan meridema and the Bulbocernus meridema is one called Lysomachia meridema, right here. An old book might call this Glauch Meridema, G-L-A-U-X. So this has opposite leaves, like all the Lysomachia species, and it will have white flowers, but it doesn't appear to quite be flowering yet. And this is another one that likes tolerates more salt inundation. And actually, now that I think about it, we're actually further from the Skagit River mouth than we were at Craft Island, and so at high tide this must be inundated with a little bit more saline water, just because it's not right next to the river. This is Plantigo meridema, and it tolerates salt inundation. It has a pretty fleshy, thick leaf with parallel veins on that leaf. Usually the leaf margins are smooth, but sometimes they'll have little teeny barbs here or there, almost like warts. Here's one with a little wart on the side, just right there. The flowers are in spikes. Here we see one with the male parts of the flower. There's maybe just starting to wither. The anthers are turned brown now, whereas they are more of a yellow color when they're blooming. And here's a spike that hasn't yet opened up. This plant is edible, and I really enjoy the leaves, especially in the spring up until maybe June. You could actually just fill a salad bowl with the leaves and put a little dressing on it and munch away. It's fairly mild compared to many of our other wild greens. So this is about as big as the Plantigo meridema or seaside plantain will get. Sometimes they're more pressed against the ground, and sometimes the leaves are maybe just a third this thickness. But this one's quite large. Sometimes this plant is confused with this here, the Triglocan meridema, the seaside arrowgrass. But remember that the Triglocan has a leaf that smells like cilantro, and the leaves tend to be a little more linear, whereas the leaves of the plantain meridema are more flat. And then once this is flowering, the flower spikes are really tall on the Triglocan. This is 2 feet, maybe almost 3 feet tall, whereas these usually are less than a foot tall. All right, I'm pretty wet. It's rained all day despite the forecast for some afternoon sunshine. And there are a few more species I hope to pick up tomorrow or something like that. But I'm gonna throw in or get out the towel and dry off and call it a day. All right, the sun finally came out. It's actually 2 days later, and I am down at Port Susan Bay. Now, a lot of people haven't heard of that. It's near Stanwood, and it's where the Stillaguamish River empties into the Salish Sea. And I came here because my wife is doing some coastal monitoring, looking at sediment accretion down here. But anyway, it's great because there's a really good salt marsh community. The salt marsh here is a little bit like the one at Craft Island around the Skagit River, in that the river forks into 2 branches as it comes down and drains into the ocean. So the north branch empties about a mile to my north here, way up there, and the south branch is about a half mile from me to the south here. And that means that all the freshwater sources are relatively far away, and we have a community here that's a little more salt loving. So it's a good opportunity to see some of those species. And before I dive into the species, I just want to say a bit about where I am in the marsh. We can see there's a lot of grassy looking things up there. That's where the low marsh starts. And then all along here, this is basically mud flat. There are a few plants growing in on the mud flat, but for the most part it looks pretty muddy, so it's a good name for that kind of community. Okay, and specifically right here where I'm standing, this is one of those distributary channels, or blind channels rather, and so water from the whole marsh plain it goes up at high tide and covers that area, and then at the low tide, it drains in these blind channels. And this one's pretty small. Sometimes they're so deep that they can be like 6 or 8 feet deep sometimes. This is great because I can easily cross it. Sometimes they're really difficult to cross. Okay, there happens to be a plant that loves growing in these channels, and this plant is tolerant of brackish water. It'll also grow in fresh water. It's called ditchweed or Rupia meridema. And I can point out a few features. So here I have some in a tray. Remember I mentioned that it's good to look at these aquatic plants in a tray sometimes, because when you pull them out of the water, their leaves just go limp. So this is a submerged leaf plant, and when you put it back in water, the leaves fan out and you can see all the features a little bit better. So there are, the submerged leaf plants, from a distance, many of them look very similar to each other. But for this kind of brackish ditch environment, this is a good candidate. The Rupia is a good candidate for growing there. Sometimes you'll get Japanese eelgrass, Zostera japonica. But this one is distinct from Zostera in that it has a branching stem. Typically the leaves alternate up that stem. Now where they're flowering, here's a flower. Where they are flowering, sometimes it'll just be opposite branching. Now where those leaves come and meet the stem, there is a structure called a ligule, and that's just a really fat leaf base that kind of surrounds the stem a little bit. When we get into the grass unit, I'll show you some more definitive pictures of a ligule, but this one you could just see that it's really sort of wide around the part where the stem meets the branch of the plant meets the stem. Very long linear leaves. These flower clusters, let's see if I can get that spread out a little more. All the flowers are kind of compacted, capitate they say in botany speak, which means head-like. It's on a peduncle, it's called, a stalk, and that is pretty short right now. It'll actually get quite a bit longer throughout the growing season, and sometimes they're really coiled. They look like a spring, and I don't know why sometimes they're coiled and sometimes they're not, but all the ones in this particular ditch don't have that coiled nature. They're just straight. So that is Rupia meridema, another meridema plant. Lots of those in the salt marsh. Most of these little tufts here are a plant called Spurgularia. Now, here's one up close. The Spurgularias most of them have opposite leaves. You can see that these are fairly succulent. A lot of plants that can handle more salt, saline water, have these succulent leaves, like the Salicornia. And then the flowers are in short-stalked little, they're just single flowers on short stalks coming out of the leaf axils. There's one, here's another, and it looks like it's actually going to seed right now, so it's done flowering. But they have these green sepals, and they are probably white or pink. This is in the Caryophyllaceae, or sometimes called the pink family. I guess because many of the members have pink flowers. So I'm going to have to take a peek at the key to tell you exactly which species this is. I think it's Spurgularia canadensis, but I probably shouldn't have said that because I might end up being wrong. We can see that it has a pretty pinkish stem right now. Here where it's, I don't know, up on the mudflat a bit more, I noticed that the ones along the channel were greener overall. It doesn't appear that the leaves have any hairs or glands on them. And it sure would be nice to have a flower color, but we don't have that. Well, that was an unsatisfactory keying experience because the key asked for floral features and we don't have any flowers right now. But the fact that the stems appear to be hairless and some other features, you know, the habitat included, make me think that it is actually Spigularia canadensis. So I'm going to go with that as a tentative identification. I noticed another one in amongst the bulrushes. We're going to take a closer look at that, and it actually might be a little delayed in its phenology because it's shadier in there, whereas out here, lots of sun, it probably is, you know, there's a chance it's still flowering back in the bulrushes. Okay, but one more plant down here in the mud flat. Here we go. It's a nice little patch of it here. This is a very small plant, about the smallest plant here in the mud flats. It almost looks like a little carpet of grass. This is called Subularia aquatica. And you're just going to have to trust me on this because it doesn't have the flowers right now, but these leaves are less than an inch long, and you know, each little plant maybe has 4 or 5 leaves. So that's the Subularia aquatica. It has a little teeny white flower when it does flower, and you know, look for it in mud flats, really. It can tolerate saline areas. You could also see it in pretty brackish or almost fresh areas. I think what it needs is the water fluctuation that's found in salt marshes. It can handle that well, and fine sediment. Okay, so we got lucky, or logic worked. Here is more of that Spigularia in amongst the bulrushes, and it's actually flowering. So I've taken a peek at a few of the flowers, got a collection here, and some floral features that are important are the number of stamens. So this one has between 2 and 5 stamens, and that brings us down to just 2 options in the key, either Spigularia canadensis, a native, or Spigularia salina, a non-native. And we could tell the canadensis from the salina by looking at the tips of the leaves. So are the very tips of the leaves, do they have a small point called a mucronate tip, just a little teeny hair tip point at the tip, or do they lack that? And these lack the mucronate tip. So the 2 to 5 stamens, the lack of any hairs on the leaves, and the lack of the mucronate tips on the leaves make it Spigularia canadensis. There are really 3 important salt marsh grasses. We covered Disticus already. I'm going to save Agrostis for our last week, where we're going to focus more on grasses. And then this one here, this is Dischampsia. This is Dischampsia cespitosa, and like the name implies, it is cespitose. So look, all of these flowering stems come from the same clumped rhizome. And this plant gets pretty tall. You can see it's probably close to 4.5, 5 feet tall, probably 5 feet tall. And right now it has this kind of grayish, silvery look to it. This one over here, sometimes they look more like this, where they have kind of a purple, silvery look to them. I don't know if you can get that. This plant is really difficult to photograph and probably isn't showing up on video very well. But some features that I recognize, I mean, besides the fact that it's a tall plant in the salt marsh, are the most of the leaves are basal. It looks like the culms are bare, but if you look closely, it does have a few little leaves on the culms. And then if you break the culm in half, it is actually hollow on the inside. Now, some grasses are hollow and some aren't, so that's not going to tell you, that feature alone isn't going to tell you that it's Deschampsia cespitosa, but that's a good one. All right, the inflorescence is pretty open. The branches of the inflorescence kind of spread quite a bit. Maybe roughly triangular in shape. So I'm not going to get too into the weeds, so to speak, with this species, because when we do our grass unit, I'm going to discuss all the grass vocabulary then. But really, Deschampsia cespitosa, the Disticus spicata, and a couple different types of agrostis are the main grasses you're going to find in salt marshes. You know, reed canary grass can show up in the fresh end of a marsh, up in the high marsh, and maybe dune grass occasionally, but that's really more of a shoreline plant than a salt marsh plant. Today for our lab, I'm going to review most of the juncuses that we saw in the field and introduce a couple new ones as well. So let me start with the new ones. Right here are two species that look from a distance pretty darn similar. They have these, the inflorescence is tightly compacted into these spherical heads. So this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 heads. This one has 2, but they look almost totally spherical from a distance. Now the key feature for this is Juncus encepholius, or dagger leaf rush, is that it has leaves that are really wide, almost iris-like, and so it looks kind of like a grass on the lower part. But when you get up a little higher, it still is flattened, but it becomes a little bit more roundish. It looks like somebody just took the round culm of a typical juncus and squished it. So this one is one of only 3 species of all the different juncuses we have in Washington that has a flattened culm, and this one is the most flat of all of them. Okay, the next one is another that has these spikelets that are spherical. This one has 3, this one has 4. They're all up near the tip. But this one has a roundish culm. It's a little bit flattened, but it doesn't look at all grass-like, and the leaves are not grass-like. They're also mostly round like the stem. So this is Juncus bolanderi. And both of these will grow up kind of in the fresher parts, the marsh transition zone where it might be getting a little bit shrubbier, and only in marshes that are getting a lot of fresh water. So we have Juncus encepholius with the flattened stem, Juncus bolanderi with the round stem, and both of those have these spherical heads. Now there are other rushes that have those spherical heads, but they're going to be up in the mountains like Juncus mertensiana. Don't see that in our salt marshes. Okay, we covered this one in the field. This was the Juncus articulatus. So it has a terminal inflorescence. Remember that the stems often kind of creep or start out horizontal and kind of arch upwards a bit, and they'll root at the nodes. So I'm not going to say more about that because we discussed it well in the field. Here is a Juncus buffonius. We saw this in the field as well, but one that is, oops, a little piece of grass in there. One that is small, and here is a taller one. Remember, a feature that I mentioned is that it basically has the flower capsules are both low and high. They're all over the place, and that has a lot of these little short leaves near the flowers. Okay, that's Juncus buffonius, or toad rush is the common name for it. This is not the greatest specimen, but this here is the Juncus balticus with the lateral inflorescence. This is a rhizomatous species, so I just picked one of what could be, a 1 acre clone. And then the other one with the lateral inflorescence that I talked about was Juncus effusus, much bigger one. And here I have a couple different ones just to show that sometimes the lateral inflorescence is a little more tightly packed, and then sometimes it's a little more spread out. And we actually have a few different subspecies of Juncus effusus. Some are native and some aren't. And then lastly over here, this is one that we didn't see in the field, but could have potentially, especially in the saltier areas. This is Juncus gerardii. Now this likes really salty marshes. It is another rhizomatous species, and we can see that the inflorescence is terminal, and the capsules are just individual. They're all individual and they're all very small. So that is, it has a very delicate look to it. Compare it to the Juncus articulatus, which has the flowers and capsules are in these clusters of several altogether, usually maybe 4 or 5. And then the other, the extreme end of that is this Juncus bulanderi and also the Juncus encepholius, where there might be 30 or 50 flowers all packed together in that head. Okay, so these are the most likely candidates for finding in marsh. Some of them like it a little fresher, like the bulanderi, Juncus bulanderi and Juncus encepholius, and some of them like it really salty, like this Juncus gerardinia. That concludes our salt marsh unit, and we looked at marshes that have a variety of different salinities, ranging from very fresh near the mouth of the Skagit River. We went to the Fir Island Farm marsh, and that was quite a bit saltier. And then down here at Port Susan Bay, we also saw some saltier marshes as we got further away from that river system, or a different river system down here. And tried to give you a good flavor for the rushes, the Juncaceae. We saw some bulrushes too, and a wide variety of herbaceous plants. So that'll be it. Hope you tune in next time. We're going to be looking at the fen community, and we have a treat because we get to go to Daly Prairie, a place that you need special permission to go to. So hope you tune in then.